Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, when no news is bad news. Israel attacks a Syrian target, but where are the headlines? Death in Armenia, and how a Turkish law gets in the way of reporting a story that's almost 100 years old. Sarkozy decides enough is enough. The French president walks out on American television. And the fake news conference that aimed to make the U.S. government look good, but only made it look worse. Welcome back. September 6th, 2007. An airstrike by Israeli jets on a rural target in Syria that, according to satellite imagery, looked like this before the bombing and now looks like this. It's gone. Big news, you might think, but where was the coverage in Israel and Syria, and why were the Arabic and global news media so slow to pick up on the attack? It took a long time for the storyline to emerge that the Israelis had struck the site of a nuclear plant being built with the help of North Korea. Our starting point this week, the airstrike on Syria, how the Israeli media handled it, and what the coverage or lack of coverage of a story with global implications says about media and politics in today's Middle East.
As news stories go, this one started out asking more questions than it answered.
Very suspicious activity going on here. Why, for example, was the Israeli government not admitting that it was involved in this raid?
The government is not denying nor confirming, which generally, I mean, every Israeli knows how to read this. It means we did it, but we don't want to talk about it.
Israel has a long history of complex military deception as far as the information and the media is concerned.
Why was the Syrian government complaining only about the fact that it was attacked, but didn't really say what was attacked?
And what about the rest of the Arab media, their relative silence on this story?
You heard nothing on the Arab level, which, some people argue basically reflects the fact that Syria is extremely isolated, especially vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, for example, that happens to control a lot of the Arab media.
The story first surfaced September 7th, the day after the raid. The Associated Press quoted the official Syrian Arab news agency when it reported Israeli aircraft dropped munitions onto deserted areas of Syria. 5 days later, the New York Times reported that American officials confirmed Israeli warplanes launched airstrikes inside Syria. The paper quoted an anonymous U.S. official saying Israel had previously photographed possible nuclear installations that might have been supplied with material from North Korea. That was the first mention of the alleged nuclear angle. Israel's government, the Times said, had repeatedly declined to comment, but there were clear signs that Israelis were leaking the story out through other countries.
There was a very sophisticated, coordinated campaign, and you don't have to be Oliver Stone to think that there's a coordinated campaign here. But you had, presumably, Israeli officials and experts doing targeted leaks to the UK and US media.
At first, the Israeli media were quiet on the story. Even Israel's critics admit that the country's news media usually do quality work. They can be highly critical of their own government, with the exception, and it's an important one, of military matters.
They like to publish scandals. They are ruthless in this respect. But when it comes to the country's security and military operation, they had to respect the authority.
It comes from the fact that so many journalists themselves are, at the same time that they are journalists, they're also reserve soldiers. They vote in the elections, they're a part of the society. And I think the majority of journalists, especially ones who cover military issues, have this sense of real or imagined responsibility.
Israeli journalists did eventually get stories into their media by piggybacking on reports published outside the country, stories that may well have originated in Israeli newsrooms.
It's a known secret that sometimes when Israeli newspapers want to publish something, they would leak it to a foreign source and then quote the source, which is allowed.
But you must refer to a source abroad, like we read in the FT in London, or we read in the Washington Post, or a reporter in New York said this. They were reduced to that.
1 week after the raid, both the Washington Post and the New York Times were leading with the nuclear angle, quoting anonymous U.S. officials who said the information originated in Israel. The papers did not specify if their Israeli sources were in government or media. By this stage, the U.S. news channels were getting in on the fun.
Both sides keeping mostly silent, and so is the White House.
I wonder if you could
tell us what the target was, whether you supported this bombing raid?
I'm not going to comment on the matter. Would you like another question?
In today's top story, now it's official. The Israel Air Force did conduct an airstrike against a target in Syria on September 6th.
2 days after that, there was confirmation from Israel of the raid, but not from the Prime Minister, from the opposition leader, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Netanyahu, the Likud chief, decided to violate the secrecy agreement and to speak up. Then the President Bashar al-Assad of Syria gave an interview to the BBC in which he admitted the raid took place.
The Syrian Prime Minister was now on the record, as were the Israelis. But more than 2 weeks after that, President Bush, whose own government's officials had been leaking the story for more than a month, was still refusing to talk about the raid.
In self-defense,
I understand where you're trying to take it. I understand where you're trying to take it. It's a clever ruse to get me to comment on it, but I'm not going to. Thank you.
So the story the world was hearing about what happened in Syria came from mostly Israeli sources, via unnamed American sources, and delivered primarily through Western and U.S. media.
Without having quotable sources, the story really doesn't have two legs to stand on. It becomes a speculative theory that builds upon itself. And the problem with that is that as the media continues to report the speculation, the unnamed sources, it becomes almost a fact in public life, in the United States especially.
For all the anonymous sources, unanswered questions, and unorthodox reporting, there is a moral to this news story and how the world was told about it.
Despite all the problems that the United States may be having in Afghanistan, in Iraq, for example, the media and the American public can be marshaled for policy objectives that emanate from Washington. They know how to use and mobilize the media. So, from a Syrian perspective, they've not only been slow out of the gate, they not only have been unable to counteract the different angles that this story is coming at them from in the different media landscapes, but they're also clearly not learning their lessons either.
And in an age in which media are a weapon, with wars fought in the air and on the airwaves, those are lessons worth learning.
Our Global Village Voices now with their take on the coverage of what happened in Syria.
The silence over the Syrian affair in the Israeli media is something that's being viewed by Israelis as highly commendable. To we foreign journalists, and indeed to members of the public internationally, it may look as though the lack of reportage on the Syrian affair in Israel was a case of a lack of media freedom. I think you'll find that most journalists in Israel felt that it was their national duty not to report the details of this issue, but rather to reflect what was being said in the New York Times and the Washington Post and bring that back to the viewers, readers and listeners at home.
Many Arabs think that the Israeli media is free, but it's free in Israel. In other words, it's very pro-Israeli. It represents the Israeli point of view all the time. That's why Arabic audience don't trust the Israeli media. They feel like it represents the voice of the Israeli army.
We're always looking for more Global Village Voices. Email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. And if you've got a smart take on the news media, wherever you are, we'll find a way to get you on the air. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. FEMA, the American Emergency Management Agency that took such a pounding in the media for its inadequate response to Hurricane Katrina, is back in trouble over the California wildfires. News channels in the U.S. provided live coverage of a news conference in which a FEMA official took questions on the wildfires. He handled them flawlessly, as if he knew what was coming. Turns out he did. The news conference was fake. The questions were coming from FEMA's own employees, but unsuspecting news channels aired it anyway. Once the real story emerged, real journalists took aim at FEMA for supplying them with fake news.
Well, you have to ask what were they thinking, and all I could think is that reality didn't work for them very well in Katrina, so why not fiction?
The issue made it all the way to the White House, which denied any prior knowledge of what FEMA did.
It is not a practice that we would employ here at the White House, or that we certainly don't condone it.
The former Soviet satellite state of Uzbekistan has been accused of murdering a reporter, and the accusation comes from neighboring Kyrgyzstan. 26-year-old Alisher Saipov, an ethnic Uzbek, was one of Central Asia's most daring journalists. He frequently took on the Uzbek government for corruption and human rights crimes. He was gunned down last week in Kyrgyzstan, and officials there say the Uzbek Secret Service was behind the murder. Saipov made his name with his reporting of civil unrest in Andijan in 2005, in which hundreds of protesters were killed by Uzbek government forces. Saipov was one of few journalists who risked their lives to report the Andijan story. Human rights organizations and journalist watch groups now fear that Saipov's contacts may also be targeted. It's been over 5 years since Al Jazeera cameraman Sami Al-Haj was sent to Guantanamo Bay. Labeled an enemy combatant by the U.S., he's the only journalist to be held in that prison. This week, Al Jazeera organized a series of 3 demonstrations in Doha, London, and Paris demanding that Al-Haj be given a fair trial or released. Al-Haj was arrested by Pakistani border guards in 2001 as he was crossing into Afghanistan. The Pakistanis accused him of having links to Al-Qaeda and handed Al-Haj over to U.S. forces, who he accuses of torturing him. Sami Al-Haj's imprisonment is among the incidents that have pushed the United States up to 6th place on the U.S.-based Committee to Protect Journalists list of countries that are holding the most reporters behind bars. The editor of the Irish Times and a reporter there have been told by Ireland's High Court to either start answering questions or face the prospect of going to jail. Last year, the Times rocked the Irish political establishment when it printed some leaked documents related to alleged illegal payments to Prime Minister Bertie Ahern. Ireland's High Court has ordered the Times to reveal the source of the allegation. So far, the paper has refused, and it also says it has destroyed the evidence. Mr. Ahern has strongly denied any wrongdoing. And French President Nicolas Sarkozy recently made his divorce official, and it's not like he's having a love affair with the American media either. In a recent interview with the CBS show 60 Minutes, taped before the divorce announcement was made, Sarkozy was peppered with the kinds of questions about the state of his marriage and the whereabouts of his wife Cecilia that the French media tend to shy away from.
It seems that every day we're hearing another story about your wife. What's going on?
If I had something to say about Cecilia, I would certainly not do so here.
But there's a great mystery.
Sarkozy took the microphone off and walked out on the 60 Minutes crew, which happily put the video of the famously short-tempered French leader on the air anyway. Coming up after the break, reporting history and the Turkish media's part in coming to terms with the country's past.